Chapter 4. Development of the Revolutionary Technique. 4 revolutions in history merit our special attention. The study and comparison of the methods employed therein will reveal, on the one hand, basic similarity between them, and the other, an interesting advance in technique with each succeeding upheaval. So in other words, the Jews get better and better at these revolutions as time goes on. It is as if we studied the various stages in the evolution of the modern rifle from the origin of Old Brown Bess. The revolutions in question are firstly the Cromwellian, secondly the French, thirdly the Russian, and lastly the Spanish Revolution of 1936. All 4 can be proved to have been the work of international Jewry. The first 3 succeeded, and secured the murder of the reigning monarch and the liquidation of his supporters. In each case, Jewish finance and underground intrigue are clearly traceable, and the earliest measures passed by the revolutionaries have been emancipation for the Jews. Cromwell was financed by various Jews, notably Manasseh ben Israel and Carahal, the great Jew, contractor to his army. On this occasion, Jewish influence remained financial and commercial, while the propaganda weapons and medium were semi-religious, all the Cromwellians being soaked in Old Testament Judaism. Some, such as General Harrison, even carried their Judaism to the length of advocating the adoption of the Mosaic Law as the law of England, and substitution of Saturday as a Sabbath in place of the Christian Sunday. And this was done in some of the churches, actually. Seventh-day Adventists now celebrate on Saturdays. I'd be interested to see if those are of Calvinistic origin, that church, the Seventh-day Adventists. Moving on. We are all familiar with the absurd Old Testament passages which the Roundhead rank and file adopted as names, such as Sergeant Obadiah. Quote, behind their kings in chains and their nobles in fetters of iron, end quote. The Cromwellian Revolution was short-lived. The work of destruction had not been sufficiently thorough to frustrate counter-revolution and restoration of the old regime. A second revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1689, was necessary. That's shortly after the private Central Bank of England, the Rothschild Bank, or Bank of England, was established. This again was financed by Jews, notably Salman Medina, Sasso, Moses Machado, and others. By the French Revolution of 1789, so 100 years after the Glorious Revolution of 1689 in England, by the French Revolution of 1789, the technique had been notably improved. Secret societies had been developed throughout France on a grand scale in the preceding years. The plans for the liquidation of the former regime are by this time far more drastic. The judicial murder of a kindly and well-intentioned king and a few nobles is replaced by mass murders in prisons and in private houses of the whole of the nobility, clergy, gentry, the bourgeoisie, regardless of sex. So in other words, they killed everyone in the French Revolution, and it was Jews that did it, and they did it to men and women. The Cromwellian damage and desecration of a few churches by their temporary use as stables is developed into general wrecking of Christian churches, or their conversion into public lavatories, brothels, and landmarks, brothels and markets, and the banning of the practice of Christian religion and even the ringing of church bells. Civil war is not allowed to develop. The army is sidetracked and kept apart from its king by his seizure at an early stage. So powerful is the unseen control by 1789 that apparently the dregs of the French population victoriously liquidate all their natural leaders, in itself a most unnatural and suspicious phenomenon. More suspicious still is the sudden appearance of strong bands of armed hooligans who march on Paris from Loins and the Marseille, and are recorded as being obviously foreigners. Here we have the first formations of alien mercenary and criminal elements forcing revolutions upon a country not their own, which were to have their finished and expanded prototype in the international brigades which attempted to force Marxism on Spain 150 years later. Wow, this really ties in with the 200 Years Together book I'm listening to, as narrated by Dr. Air Jordan Peterson. It's incredible how they keep using the same techniques, and I didn't realize that these techniques that they used in Russia were actually pioneered this well during the French Revolution. It's amazing. England in the 17th century had not been dismembered and hideously remolded on alien lines, but all familiar landmarks in 18th century France were destroyed. The splendid and historic names and titles of countries, departments, and families were scrapped, and France divided into numbered squares occupied merely by quote-unquote citizens. Even the months of the calendar were changed. The national flag of France, with its lilies and its glories, was banned. Instead, the French received the tricolor, the badge of rape, murder, and rapine. However, the planners made a mistake. The tricolor might not be the honored and famous flag of France. It might be dripping with the blood of massacre, regicide, and villainy. It might be stinking with the slime of the Jewish criminals who designed and foisted it upon the French people. But it was proclaimed the national flag, and the national flag it became. And with the national flag came the national army, and a national leader, Napoleon. It was not long before this great Frenchman ran up against the secret powers, who up till then controlled the armies of France. They had planned to use these armies to revolutionize all European states, one after another, to overthrow all leadership and establish rule of the mob, apparently, in reality, of course, their own, meaning they were going to do like an egalitarian revolution, but really take control themselves. Just in this manner do the Jews today plan to use the Red Army. Such a policy directed by aliens of this type could not long continue once a national army had thrown up a real national leader. Their outlook and policy must inevitably be poles apart. It was not long before the first consul challenged and overthrew these aliens and their puppets. In other words, nationalism triumphed over Jewish internationalism, and Napoleon wrested control of France from the Jews. By the year 1804, Napoleon had come to recognize the Jew and his plans as a menace to France, and all that the revolution had swept away he systematically restored. From this time onwards, Jewish money financed every coalition against Napoleon, and the Jews today boast that it was Rothschild rather than Wellington who defeated Napoleon. Knowing these things, Hitler, on his occupation of Paris, immediately ordered a permanent guard of honor to be mounted over Napoleon's tomb at the Invalides, and had the body of L'Aiglon, Napoleon's son by Maria Louisa, brought from Austria and buried at last in his proper place at the side of his father. When we come to examine the Russian Revolution, we find that the technique is still bolder and far more drastic. On this occasion, no national flag, army, or anthem is permitted. After the dregs of the community have apparently accomplished the impossible and liquidated every other class down to and including the kulak, parenthetically here, a man with 3 cows, end parenthetical, they are herded into a polyglot force called the Red Army. Over them waves an international red flag, not a Russian flag. Their anthem is the Internationale, or the international song. The technique of revolution in Russia was so perfected that to this day it has secured the Jewish regime established there against all counterstrokes. And this is in 1952, so Ramsey is claiming that in 1952, when this book was written, the Jews were still firmly in power of the Soviet Union, which Jewish espionage in this country with the plans for our atomic weapons, including the hydrogen bombs a year earlier than that, or no, around this time, clearly indicates that the Jews in the U.S. at the very least thought the Jews were still in power in Russia, and Ramsey is saying this is indeed the case. The next revolution to merit our attention is the one that broke out in Spain in 1936. Fortunately for Europe, it was frustrated by General Franco and a number of gallant men who instantly took the field in opposition to the revolutionary forces and succeeded in a long struggle in crushing them. This achievement is all the more remarkable in view of the latest development in revolutionary organization, which was then revealed in the shape of the international brigades. These international brigades, besides representing the very latest novelty in revolutionary technique, were a remarkable production. They were recruited from criminals, adventurers, and dupes, mostly communists from 52 different countries, mysteriously transported and assembled in formations in Spain within a few weeks of the outbreak of disorder, uniformed in a garb closely related to our battle dress, and armed with weapons bearing the Jewish five-pointed star. This star and the seal of Solomon were upon the signet rings of NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and officers in this communist horde of ill-disciplined ruffians. I have seen them myself in Ware. The man who wrote 1984 also had once seen this star, and he was actually serving for the communists in Spain, fighting on the side of the Republicans or communists, when he woke up to the fact that the Republicans were communists in Spain and later wrote 1984. I'm talking, of course, about George Orwell. Moving on. By October 1936, these international brigades were already assembled in Spain in considerable numbers. Undisciplined and blackguardly though they were, the mere fact of a large and well-armed political army intervening suddenly on one side in the early stages of a civil war might reasonably have been counted upon to achieve a decision before the patriotic and decent element in the country could have time to create an adequate fighting machine. So in other words, the Jews set up an international quick reaction force for any place in the world where they could quickly deploy, like a Marine Expeditionary Unit, communist useful idiots to any country that was just starting a civil war, so that the Bolsheviks have a early mover advantage, or have the initiative early on in the battle before counter-revolutionaries can muster a defense against Jewish takeover. Though the British public were kept in total ignorance as to the true significance of what was taking place in Spain, two countries in Europe were awake to the situation. Germany and Italy had each in their turn experienced the throes of communist revolution and emerged victorious over this foulest of earthly plagues. They knew who had financed and organized the international brigades, and with what purpose Barcelona had been declared in October 1936 the capital of the Soviet states of Western Europe. At the critical moment, they intervened in just sufficient strength to counter the international brigade and enable the Spanish people to organize their own army, which, in due course, easily settled the matter. That is to say, as far as Spain was concerned. There was, however, another settlement to come. International Jewry had been seriously thwarted. They would not rest henceforth until they could have their revenge, until they could, by hook or by crook, turn the guns of the rest of the world against those two states, which, in addition to thwarting their designs in Spain, were in the process of placing Europe upon a system independent of gold and usury, which, if permitted to develop, would break the Jewish power forever. And he's talking, of course, about the system of trade established by the Germans and to a lesser extent by the Italians to get around Jewish control of international finance. If you've enjoyed this, Chapter 4 of the Nameless War, please send a campaign donation if you're qualified to. Visit littlerevolution.us and find the place to donate. Also, please donate to the American Legal Defense Fund. Anyone can donate to that. Go to ALDF Fund on Google or DuckDuckGo and send funds to the American Legal Defense Fund.